Hi, this is Jim Alexander. I'm the Executive Director of the Industry Pharmacists organization. Really so pleased to welcome everyone who's tuning in from around the country tonight. Very excited to offer this second in our series of webinars. We're partnering with the MCPHS Fellowship Program. So very grateful to the fellows who are volunteering their time tonight just to share their insights and experiences with students about the areas that are subject of the webinar. We do have, if everyone looks towards the upper left-hand part of the screen next to the Meeting Burner logo, there's a Q&A button. So the first question we had actually was, can you perform an audio check? We did that. So hopefully, if anybody's having trouble hearing or other problems, there's a chat below next to the participants. And, we could hold a conversation there. But as far as questions that come up throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A button, and we'll screen those and answer them towards the end. Again, pleased to kick this off. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Jude Ngang and his colleague, who are going to take us through a good presentation tonight, and then follow up with Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. Again, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar co-hosted by IPHO and the MCPHS University Fellowship Network. We're very excited about the increased interest in industry from pharmacy students all over the country. I'm a first-year fellow with Novartis in Boston, and with me would be Eddie Wolfson. He's a graduate of the fellowship program, and he was retained at Novartis in Boston. Eddie Wolfson graduated in 2013, so he's been with the company post his fellowship now for over a year. So as Jim mentioned, if you have any questions, please go ahead and click the question and type in your question, and we'll be able to respond at the end of the presentation. So,
Jude, let me interrupt for a second. We had a question come in already about whether there's a handout. There's no handout to share. We apologize. However, this is being recorded. It will appear on our website most likely by tomorrow morning. You'll be able to go back and reference the slides as the speakers are covering them.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for responding to that. So last week there was this is a three-part series of the webinar. So there's one that happened last week. It talked mainly about the medical affairs fellowship and the health economics and outcome research. And today we will be talking about clinical development, biomarker, which is a new fellowship program introduced by Novartis starting this year, and also quality assurance, which is offered at Pfizer. So the medical affairs and health economics and outcomes research that was presented by Ken last week focused a lot in the part of drug development that is already post-marketing, like the drugs have already been developed. So for the interest of the audience that we got last time, it ranges from 2015 graduates to 2020 graduates. So the information we'll present today would be able to satisfy the curiosity of everyone. So some information that we'll present will go back to the drug development process, which those of you who are 2015 graduates, you must have known that by now, or if not, then it's still a learning opportunity. So the fellowship program in clinical development takes place on the whole drug development process before the drug is marketed. So we'll talk a lot about that, and then we'll also focus a lot more on the biomarker and the quality assurance. The agenda today, as if you can see, it's drug development. We'll talk about drug development, translational medicine, and the clinical trial manager. That is the position that Eddie Wolfson holds right now at Novartis, post the fellowship, and then biomarker development in general, and then biomarker sample coordinator, which will be the position of the fellow after doing the biomarker fellowship, and then pharmaceutical sciences quality assurance. So to go back in the drug development process, it's mainly in two stages. There's the clinical stage and the preclinical stage. The preclinical happens in the lab and also in animals. So if you could remember your medicinal chemistry, where you have all those molecules, organic chemistry, the molecules with the various functional groups and side chains, that part takes place in the lab, and those molecules are engineered, or the synthesis is done in such a way that it will hit a particular receptor. And this receptor that be provided to this medicinal chemist by the biologists. And when they find the chemist sees that the receptor binds very well, they go back to the biologist and give their report, and then the biologist will now take this molecule and test it in tissues. And if the receptor, this molecule binds well to the receptor, if this receptor is set, let's say for example in the arteries, then this molecule could be used, for example, for hypertension to reduce blood pressure. And if this molecule binds perfectly well, then they'll move on to animal studies. This is all still part of preclinical drug development. So when the animal studies are done, they look a lot at the toxicology, if the drug is the effects, the side effects of the drug, and they keep increasing the doses until they see the maximum dose that the animals could tolerate. And when this process is done and they're satisfied with the results, then they move into the clinical phase, and that's where we come in as PharmDs. We're coming from the clinical phase. The clinical phase now means this drug is going to be tested in humans. And the clinical phase is divided into, there's two major phases. There's the translational medicine, which is the early phase, which involves phase 1 and phase 2, and then there is the late phase, which involves phase 3, and there is phase 4. So when Ken mentioned about the medical affairs last week, there was also some medical affairs employees or medical science liaisons who are also involved in some clinical studies. Those are usually phase 4 post-marketing studies. So in clinical development, I would repeat, it's two major stages, phase 1 and phase 2, and then phase 3 and phase 4. Here at Novartis, at my fellowship, we focus on phase 1 and phase 2 studies. So this gives you just a very brief background, but I would just want to point one thing. From preclinical to clinical, that's when you submit the IND, the Investigational New Drug Application, to the FDA, and the FDA approves for you to continue to humans. When you get into humans, after phase 3, then you apply for the new drug application, and then that drug is approved, it can now be marketed. So I hope this that clarifies the drug development process for those who were not very familiar with it. So the drug development fellowship that I'm in is in the translational medicine. The biomarker fellowship also is involved in the translational medicine. And then the QA fellowship is involved in both translational medicine and late phase studies also. So I'll move on to the next slide. This slide shows a package insert. So if you look at the package insert, even those of you who are P1s or P2s, you must have been exposed to the pharmacy by now, so you must have seen some package inserts. The different sections in this package insert, all this information that you see here, all this information didn't just come here randomly, or it wasn't guesswork. A lot of studies were done repeatedly to confirm each sentence, each statement that is made in the package insert. As is highlighted, you can see the mechanism of action, the PK, the drug-drug interaction, and also the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of the drug. Many studies are carried out to come up with all of these properties of the drug. So the involvement of the clinical trial leader, that is the fellowship position I'm involved in, we carry out all these studies that come up with this information that will be used to profile the drug. So if they say, for example, take the drug 2 hours after eating or 1 hour before food, or take it with a fatty meal, several studies would have been done to make sure that the bioavailability of this drug is best at this time of taking it with fatty food or 1 hour before food. So Eddie, are you on the line?
Yes, I am, Jude.
Okay, yes. So I will now pass over the microphone to Eddie. He's going to talk about the clinical trial wheel and the position of the CTL.
Thanks, Jude. Appreciate it. So as you mentioned, I am a clinical trial leader, and you can see that depicted here on the slide as a CTL. And you might also hear this title referred to at maybe another company as a study manager, maybe a project manager, and holding true to that title. I mean, functioning as the clinical trial leader and or manager. I mean, you are responsible for leading the execution of the study, for managing all of the activities and deliverables that go in to the conduct of a clinical trial. You can see here on this wheel some of the various activities and contacts for which the CTL is responsible for managing. And I do want to clarify when I say managing, this doesn't always, and often it's not the case, that the CTL or the manager is really directly responsible for managing people on their team as a direct report. So it's actually a lot of, you'll hear a common term in project management, it's influence without authority. So you have to find ways to really galvanize your team, to motivate your team, to align your team. Your team is often comprised of people of diverse backgrounds, multidisciplinary teams. You work with everybody from medical experts responsible for the science and the safety of your study, kineticists, pharmacokineticists responsible for analysis of the PK, statisticians. Also on your team, you may have people, especially in translational medicine, from a preclinical background that are on the team to facilitate, again, that transition of the compound from the bench into the clinic. And again, as the lead for that study, you're responsible for coordinating all those activities. It's also often pretty common in industry to outsource quite a few of the activities that go into a trial. So, for instance, on this slide you see sites and monitors. Though companies may sometimes have their own units in-house and their own monitoring groups, our clinical research associates, it's also not uncommon for companies to outsource these activities. So as the CTL, you're often responsible for managing those relationships, not only for selecting the site and the vendor, conducting the feasibility, assessing your various options when it comes to sites and monitors available to you that are ideal or optimal for the conduct of your trial, but also, again, for managing the work, ensuring that everybody is aligned. It's a lot of communication to ensure that the trial is conducted as it should be per the timeline and budget. And to clarify, so again, sites, of course, are responsible for the clinical conduct, and this is often outsourced. Monitors are basically your eyes and ears for a study. So as a CTL, working at the sponsor level, you're not on site. You're often not there to witness, to observe the conduct of the trial. So it's the monitor who is responsible for ensuring that the site is conducting the study in accordance with the protocol, which the sponsor authors, and ICH, or good clinical practices, again, from the International Conference on Harmonization. I mentioned vendors, just going around the wheel here. There are other activities that you may outsource. Again, members of the team. Statistical analyses may be outsourced. Data management is a common activity to outsource. Data management, so these vendors would be responsible for building and programming your data collection tools, basically the tools or the software in which all of the clinical data is entered for the trial so that you can ultimately analyze it. Research, I spoke about research and preclinical. Regulatory, a key member of the clinical trial team, responsible for not only submission of important documentation, trial-related documentation, but also serving as a liaison between the sponsor and the regulatory or the health authority. This is especially important. Well, I shouldn't say it's any more so important in translational medicine, but This is often important in determining starting doses or dose caps for maybe your first in-human study, how high you're permitted to go based on your preclinical evidence. Moving on along the wheel, safety. Again, especially at early phase, you do a lot of safety monitoring because oftentimes these compounds are brand new to the clinic. You really, though you have the preclinical evidence, it's not always entirely predictive of what's going to happen in the clinic, so you do need to be very attentive to safety, and that's true for all phases of clinical research. Documentation, there's a lot of not only regulatory documentation, but also analytical, a lot of data that's collected in studies. So oftentimes there are representatives of your trial team that are entirely responsible for documentation. Finance, again, going back to the budget. You might liaise with other teams that are working on similar compounds or the same compound, maybe a different indication. Again, development. So to relate this to translational medicine, especially in the context of Novartis, so we have the divide between phase 2 and phase 3 basically in the structure of our company. So once the compound transitions from phase 2 to phase 3, phase 3 would basically be full development. So there's a lot of communication there between basically translational medicine and quote-unquote full development. And it's that communication and that alignment is important to ensure that transition from translational medicine into full development, into those registration trials, runs smoothly. I spoke about outsourcing. And not only is the CTL involved in the selection, feasibility, management of those vendors, but you're also working closely with representatives that are responsible for executing the contracts and negotiating those budgets with those vendors. Global teams, we work across the globe. You might work in an office with representatives that are co-located with you, but again, working for a major sponsor company, you might also have associates abroad. Novartis, for instance, is a Swiss company, so we often work on teams that are spread across the U.S., Basel, India. We spread as far as Japan, and then going back west to California, we have affiliates there as well. And I would say that pretty much covers it for this slide. Jude, could I get you to advance it?
Yes, Eddie.
Thank you. Right, so moving on to the deliverables and really the key responsibilities for a CTL. Again, going back to the leadership piece, it can be an art, going back to influence without authority, especially when you're responsible for managing activities that fall under the responsibilities of people that don't report directly to you. Again, managing the clinical site. So as the CTL or the trial manager, you are responsible for ensuring not only that the study is conducted in accordance with your protocol and regulatory requirements, but you're responsible for ensuring that site is equipped and properly trained to do so. And again, you work closely with your monitors to ensure that that's done. Documentation review and approval, going back to all the documentation that we collect at, in this particular case, for example, at a site level, you do need to make sure that your vendors and your sites are qualified to conduct whatever activity it is that they are conducting. So again, going back to contracting of a clinical site, you need to make sure that the principal investigator is qualified. Often we do this with review of a CV, making sure that he's a licensed medical professional, that he is in fact qualified to conduct clinical research on of course, human subjects. Moving back to outsourcing again, liaising between laboratories and the sponsor. Lab analyses is another activity that we may outsource, not only from a safety perspective, so your blood chemistry, your hematology, your analysis, but we also might outsource analysis of special parameters, for instance, maybe a hormone like aldosterone or an immunoglobulin, so let's say IgE, for instance. Again, this might be for safety purposes or to assess the effect of the compound on the physiology of your subjects. Jude, can I get you to push forward?
Yes, Eddie.
Thank you. Right, so again, I spoke to ensuring the connection and the alignment between representatives of your team on the preclinical side, again, to ensure that your protocol is written in accordance with the preclinical data, that it makes sense, and that, for instance, that the dose that you select, that selection is substantiated with preclinical evidence that you observed in your animal models. Publishing support, so going back to the documentation, not only do you have your protocol at the beginning of the study, which basically stipulates how the trial will be conducted, but you also have the responsibility of reporting the conclusions and the findings of your trial to the health authority. So you'll put together a clinical study report, which is basically it's a comprehensive document that covers your trial from A to Z. It's several thousand pages long. And you'll work closely with actually a separate publishing group to ensure that it is formatted in accordance with the standards that the health authority expects. They call it the common technical document standards. In other words, all of these clinical study reports have to be, again, formatted and structured in a pre-specified way that's been agreed with the health authority. So you work closely with your colleagues in publishing to ensure, in this particular example, that your CSR or your clinical study report is formatted in that manner. Drug safety and epidemiology, again, going back to translational medicine and a lot of the unknowns that go with, for instance, a first in human study with that first clinical exposure of the compound. You really don't know what's going to happen. You might have a serious adverse event. This would be, in other words, an SAE. These events, it is mandatory that they are reported to the health or the regulatory authority, and there are very strict reporting time frames for these events. So within 24 hours, for instance, of the investigator becoming aware of that SAE, it has to be reported to the sponsor. And then likewise, the health authority has to be notified of that event. And as the CTL, it's your responsibility that once you're made aware of that event, that is properly documented, and that the necessary internal representatives are notified of that event so that they can ensure the proper actions are taken, especially, again, going back to notification of the health authority. Planning and feasibility, this is critical to the conduct of your trial. And it goes back to just when you're putting your protocol together, when you're writing that document, you could have a blockbuster compound in your hands, but if your trial is not designed properly, it can be a bust. And it comes back to, again, clinical feasibility. If you set up, for instance, your eligibility criteria, perhaps you set it up too stringently, or it's not feasible. You can't find these subjects because either they don't exist or they're so rare. Because again, you've set up your protocol in such a restricted manner that it's not conducive to conduct. So these are the kind of considerations that a CTL needs to take into account. And it's a team effort. You work closely with the medical representative on your team, with your kineticist, your statistician, to ensure that these considerations are conducted. And you also work with representatives in feasibility that are responsible for finding the right sites and the right investigators that can find that patient population. Going back to database entry and data maintenance, again, this may be an in-house or an outsourced activity, but as a trial lead, you need to ensure that the data is being entered into the database in a timely manner, especially if you have periodic safety reviews to ensure that your compound is basically considered safe throughout the conduct of your trial, and that there isn't any untoward event that would warrant suspension or even termination of the trial. So these are some of the critical pieces that, again, a CTL is responsible for managing and ensuring to completion. So that was my piece. I'll hand it back to Jude.
Thank you, Eddie, for that brief description of the position of the CTL. In case you just joined us, if you have any questions pertaining to the descriptions that Eddie has given, just go ahead and click question and type in your question, and we'll respond to the questions at the end of the presentation. So I'll move on now to the biomarker development. In case you don't know what a biomarker is, I'll give an example. A biomarker is like an example is LDL or C protein. Those are biomarkers. So like in the 70s, there were only about 70 biomarkers that were known that had been discovered or that were being tested. But as of today, it's over 500 different biomarkers, and these biomarkers span across various disease states. So as a biomarker development scientist, what they do is they plan and they use their knowledge and expertise in genetics, genomics, imaging, protein, cellular, molecular biology, human tissue, and statistics, and to kind of help to design and develop medicines that would be able to affect or better the outcome of various disease states. So as a biomarker expert, most of the deliverables, they do define the subtype of a disease. That's what the impact they would have is the biomarkers will be able to use. You could use it to investigate a disease and be able to tell the different types of or the different subtype of a disease, and also they could predict the efficacy of a drug. So if the drug is, of course, like LDL, the biomarker is LDL. If you take that drug, you measure the LDL levels, and you can see if that drug is potent, and also the adverse effects also. So the drug might be having some adverse effects that might be increasing or decreasing some other biomarkers, which might also have those side effects that we try to avoid most of the time. And then the biomarkers are also used in genetic profiling, where some particular individuals with certain mutations would only have to express certain biomarkers or express certain biomarkers at a different rate than others. So you could use the biomarker to also predict the particular genetic profile of a subset of patients or subjects. And then biomarker is also important in developing companion diagnostics or parallel indications. So that's why this way it becomes important, because now when you're testing the drug, especially in translational medicine, right now some things you don't know that this drug will do. So you want to test as many biomarkers as possible that you feel or that they think it's within that molecular pathway of the drug. And doing all these exploratory biomarker tests, you can come up with a hypothesis. You could see a certain biomarker that is either being increased or decreased, and that could also affect another disease state, and you can come up with a cure or a treatment for another disease state. So this was just to give you a description of the importance of biomarker development. So as a biomarker sample coordinator, which will be the position, that will be the responsibility of a fellow, you will be exposed in the drug development process in coming up, even right from the beginning at the design of the study, where you would also, the biomarkers would decide what extra biomarkers to be testing or measuring during the studies. And your input will be very important in coming up with a biomarker instruction manual, which will be used at the site, and also the site lab manual, and also the sample collection table. So at the manual will have all the information that will give all the instructions on when to collect and how to freeze and all the different processing instructions. So you're also involved in coordinating with these samples logistically around the different sites that these studies occur. And the Novartis studies, for example, are all over the globe. So sometimes the study could be in Taiwan, and you have to coordinate how that sample will be shipped probably to Switzerland. And you have other logistical issues that you need to look into consideration. Sometimes it would even be as detailed as coordinating, getting custom license to import, or getting permits from also health authorities or various governments of different countries to be able to transport or move biomarker samples across borders. So even in the labeling and storage of the biomarker samples, you're also involved in coming up with the proper labeling and storage. As I mentioned earlier, the storage procedure. So you have to label the samples in a way that it won't be confused at the site. So you look at design of all their labeling and make sure that there's no confusion, that samples will not be mixed up, because when a study is going on, there will be various samples. The biomarkers will be going to a particular lab, and the safety labs, like looking at your chemistry, will be going to another lab, and maybe your genetic samples will be going to another lab. So you have to coordinate how all these things move. So it's not a very simple task. So the biomarker is involved in the development of the clinical trial protocol right from the beginning, and also the informed consent form that the patient or the subject has to consent and sign to agree to partake or to take part in the study. So the terminology and the language and the different type of biomarkers that will be looked at, the biomarker has some input in that consent form. And also at the end, during the clinical study report, the biomarker sample coordinator also contributes in the writing of that report and the assessment and also the analysis of the biomarker samples. So this is it's a new fellowship program that just started. So hopefully there's been some interest around it. So it's something very new, so students could go and look more or read more about biomarkers. At the end, this presentation is recorded, so you can come back to it and view it and listen. And if you have, at the end, you also have our emails. If you have any questions, you can email Eddie, or you can also email me. So I'll move on to the next position, which is the QA position. It's a position that is held at Pfizer. Pfizer is the only company that offers this position with the Massachusetts, the MCPHS University Fellowship Program. So as the quality assurance, it's in the industry, it's important because of the oversight that is needed to make sure that the products that come out at the end, the medicinal products, are very, very safe and also very effective. And you also have a lot of oversight from the health authorities, like the FDA and health authorities of other countries, that do play an important part in making sure. So the quality assurance department, or the QA department, the most important overview, or the most important objective, is to make sure that the structure of the organization and the whole culture and the processes that are being done, will be able to meet good manufacturing practices or good clinical practices, right from the clinic when they're doing testing or doing clinical trials, all the way to commercialization. So as a QA fellow, you'll be involved in the whole drug development process, right from preclinical, clinical, and post-marketing. And I'll move forward to look at the various deliverables of the QA fellowship program. So in clinical supplies packaging, the fellow would be able to outline the proper elements. The fellow will be exposed to all the elements that would evaluate the QA procedure in each department that is involved in the clinical supply of supplies that are going to clinical development sites or clinical research sites. And then they would also review the batch records, for example, so that it's in compliance with the regulatory body. For the clinical supplies and system support, the fellow would understand the process of the protocol, for example, and the fellow would also be able to implement the processes and be able to inspect. So the fellow will inspect compliance and readiness of all the processes that are involved in the clinical supply system. And also there's other vendor oversight that also takes place, because a lot of, like Eddie mentioned earlier, a lot of the activities are also outsourced. So the sponsor company should be able to oversee, and it's the responsibility of the sponsor company to oversee all these activities that are being carried out by vendors. They have overall responsibility to the health authority. So as a QA fellow, you'll be involved in quite a significant amount of vendor oversight. In the research and development, the fellow would examine all the projects, even going all the way to manufacturing, like all the way to the manufacturing industry, like where the drugs are being made, and the fellow would look at it. They will be able to oversee like things like the excipients that are used in the drug, the stability, the packaging of the drugs, and also be able to design like quality assurance modules that will be able to test all these products to make sure that the end product is a very, very reliable one without any issues. And also, I mentioned the vendor oversight. The fellow is involved in coming up with usually auditing schedules, and would hold meetings and also go to sites, different site visits, just to conduct quality assurance inspections, just to make sure that the vendors are in compliance with the good manufacturing practices and also good clinical practices. So for the interest of time, I'll move on to the next module, the next slide, which also talks more about the different modules that the QA fellow will be exposed to. In technology and innovation, the fellow is also involved even in formulating processes that oversee transfer of things like data, and also transfer of information from the sponsor and to the vendor, because during that transfer process there could be a lot of flow or leak of information. So that is proprietary information is well guarded. So that's one department that the fellow is also very much involved in. I mentioned chemistry and manufacturing, where the fellow goes all the way to the manufacture, where the medicines are being put and are being manufactured, and they make sure that everything is being done properly. And they also go all the way to the transportation, the storage during transportation, to make sure that stability requirements are not violated before the medicine gets to the site. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and type the questions. We have a few questions already. Since we've come to the end right now, we would respond to the questions. So Eddie, is there any question you want to respond to?
Forgive me, Jude. I'm not seeing the questions here. Are they in the chat tab? Is that where they are?
Okay. Let me see.
If you want to pick and just field them, I can. Yeah, I can field them.
Okay, I'll just respond to the first question, and then we'll figure out. Jim would send you the questions. So the first question is: would the fellowship be more interested in someone who has had experience in research that focuses on biomarkers, or would general research experience be considered? I would say biomarker is not. It's a very fast and growing field, so not too many people have experience in. So currently, we actually have one of the biomarker sample coordinators who was a former fellow. I think not at the Boston campus, but he's there right now. So I think any research experience would help, but basic research, that would also help, because in the basic research you would have been exposed to a lot of the biomarkers and biomarker analysis at the basic level. But general research experience, it's okay. So all you need to do is to show that you're really interested and you're very, very efficient, and you could manage and have good project management skills, and that would be enough. And then the next question is, recently biomarker-based patient selection led to unusually efficient approval of Zycada by FDA. Have you found that EMA is less willing to accept the single-arm phase 1, phase 2 trial? Unfortunately, I can't comment on that. I'm not very much aware of this issue, so I would pass on that question, but I can't tell who sent it. If I could get your email, then maybe I could look forward into it, and then I will reply to you. The next question is this a 2-year fellowship? Yes, the Biomarker Fellowship is a 2-year fellowship, and the Clinical Development Fellowship is also a 2-year fellowship. So are there any other questions? Okay, so while waiting for the questions to come in from Jim, I just want to mention one thing. To apply for the fellowship position, you have to go through PPS. So you have to sign on to ASHP mid-year, and then you sign up again into PPS, and then create a profile, and then you would see the positions listed, and you would see, I think Novartis in Boston has 3 positions, and then the MCPHS University positions are all over there, and many other fellowship programs also. So in case you have any questions later on, my email is right there. Eddie's email is right there on the screen. Just don't hesitate to send us an email at any time. Jim, are you on the line?
Yeah, there was another question I sent you about, do any of the fellowships require a residency as a precursor?
Okay, the residency is not a requirement. The requirement is the graduation from an accredited PharmD program, and you to graduate in good standing, like you graduated. But having a residency still doesn't hurt. If someone is already a resident, they could still go ahead and apply for the position if they're very, very much interested in it. I would go ahead and mention that even last year during my time at media, I met quite a few residents who were also going for fellowship positions, and one of our co-fellows is a former resident, and we went ahead and pursued a fellowship. So, but it's not a requirement to have a residency before doing the fellowship.
Next question came up about, is there any GPA requirement?
There is no strict specific GPA requirements. You just have to be a good student, of course. It's good to show that you are a good student, and it's also good to see what else you did apart from being a good student. So there's no strict GPA cutoff. But I would say if your GPA, if you feel like your GPA is not strong enough, you should be able to defend it with reasons why it's not that strong, or maybe you were involved in a lot of other activities. So it's a whole spectrum of things that are looked for, and it's not just GPA alone. I hope that answers the question.
I had sent you another question. Did you receive that, Jude?
Okay, there's a question. What are some of the differences between clinical research scientist position and a clinical trial leader position? So a clinical research scientist, for example, is I would give now that each company. What I would say first is each sponsor, each company, they have different names and different terms, what we call different positions. The clinical trial leader in Novartis, maybe if you go to another company, they might call it clinical trial manager, clinical project manager. But the clinical research scientist would be someone who is not that much involved in the operations of things. So as a clinical trial leader, you're more involved in the operation of managing and coordinating the full clinical trial. So you do bring all the pieces together. As Eddie was explaining, you are the hub of the wheel, while a clinical research scientist would have one or two particular spokes at the end of that wheel, not really at the center of the hub, like the clinical trial leader who coordinates everything. So a clinical research scientist would have one of the positions. So we could say a scientist, like let's say a biomarker scientist, is just involved in the biomarker part, or the human biomarkers. So that could be an example of a clinical research scientist. Okay, the next question is, does the program accept F1 students or international students? It's a 2-year fellowship, so you're required to have at least a green card or be a U.S. citizen. Most F1 students, they're able to have the OPT immediately after graduation, which lasts only for a year. So they will not be able to continue for the second year of the fellowship program. So that's one of the main reasons why you're required to be to have a green card or be a U.S. citizen. However, there are other fellowship positions with other programs that do accept F1 students, and usually they're one-year fellowship positions. So our advice for you to look at that if you're an F1 student.
Jude, I sent you another question. There's also some appearing in the chat if you want to field some of those.
Okay, I would have to get off the screen. Okay, the one question is it possible to skip mid-year to apply for the fellowship? It is highly recommended for you to get to mid-year for, I think, most of the fellowship programs, because you have to go through an initial interview at mid-year, and through that initial interview, the candidates will be selected and invited for an on-site interview. So I don't know if it's possible, but I think it's still possible to, if you're really a very good candidate and you're very confident of yourself, you can go ahead. But I would advise that it's very much recommended for you to go to mid-year and go through that initial screening before you're invited for the on-site interview. The on-site interview positions are limited. However, there's a lot more flexibility in interviewing a lot more candidates during mid-year.
I'd also just like to add that you might want to check out the fellow match that IPHO is offering. Actually, I know that a company already interviewed people on site last week in the Boston area. So not every company is going to mid-year, and even some of those who are inviting candidates to submit their materials through the fellow match system on IPHO, so that they can get a good handle on who their candidates are.
Good. Thank you, Jim. So I just saw another question, is how long is the Quality Assurance Fellowship? It's also a 2-year fellowship program. All the fellowship programs with the MCPHS University Fellowship Network, they're all 2-year positions. And then as another question, and do you have to be licensed in the state of Massachusetts to be practiced to have the fellowship program? No, not initially. It's not you don't have to be licensed, because by the time you're invited for on-site interview or given the position, you're not yet licensed. But it's recommended for you to get licensed within the subsequent months at the beginning of the fellowship program.
I think generally speaking, you're not delivering direct patient care, so a pharmacy license is not going to be required for the most part across the 260 different fellowships. I also wanted to just add a little something on the question about the residency. The fellowships are terrific pathways to enter the pharmaceutical industry, but they're also very competitive. So you should be investigating a plan B if your career goal is really to land in the pharmaceutical industry. There's many students every year who are really talented but just aren't able to land one of these positions because they're so difficult to get. I don't want to discourage people, but just to be, just to provide reality on it, it is competitive. So we recommend that a residency is a very good pathway, and then you might end up going back to do a fellowship. You might spend a couple years in clinical practice and then enter the pharmaceutical industry in a different way. So there's about 8,000 pharmacists working in industry today, and only about 1,200 ever completed a fellowship program. So that'll give you an idea that there are a lot of different pathways to reach the pharmaceutical industry. I do love fellowships. I was a fellow myself, and those are an excellent way to get there. But should you be one of the ones who applies and does not get accepted, that doesn't mean you're never going to be able to work in the pharmaceutical industry. Residency would be an excellent pathway for you to consider.
Thank you, Jim, for that explanation. Eddie, there is a question for you. I just sent it to you. The question is, as a clinical trial leader, I understand there is a large emphasis on management with different functional positions. How many projects do CTS juggle at one specific time? Eddie, if you could respond to that, then I could follow as a fellow.
Sure. So that, of course, will vary by company, by group, by complexity and size of your project. Generally speaking, in translational medicine, at least within our group, CTL1s, we have three levels of CTL. CTL1s will generally manage anywhere from 2 to 3, maybe simpler studies. These go back to the clinical pharmacology studies, the PK trials that Jude was referencing when he was reviewing the package insert. As you advance, you might take on somewhere between 4 to 5 as you go from a 2 to a 3. And again, as you continue to ascend, the complexity of those trials increases. So CTL2 and 3 might be doing some more of the efficacy trials, the phase 2. These are the multi-country, multi-site proof of concept studies where that's that first demonstration of efficacy in that indication with that compound or impact on that pathway, again, in a clinical setting. Those can often be, again, rather large studies, maybe not in terms of the actual enrollment because it's still translational medicine. It's phase 1, phase 2, but you might need to work with upwards of 15, 20, 25 sites in order to get those subjects, especially if it's a more rare indication. And then to speak on the development side, it's the clinical project managers, basically the counterpart of the CTL in full development. Again, depending on the size of the trial and their level, generally one trial in full development is certainly enough because you're enrolling generally thousands and thousands of patients in even more countries than you would get involved in usually with a phase 2. Jude, did you want to comment on fellow responsibilities?
Thank you, Eddie. So as a
Sure.
fellow, I'm just 4 months into the program, and I've been introduced to a few projects, and there are some that are very intense. So each study has different phases. So I was fortunate enough to meet one project right at the beginning. So I started working on that, and I have a mentor who oversees all I do, but the responsibilities are I have the autonomy to able to respond and act and respond to every requirement or everything that is needed. So that keeps me very busy, and so I have 2 other projects that I'm involved in. But the other projects are not really that intense because you could have a study that is in the maintenance phase. It has started, and subjects are just being dosed. So all you do is just monitor certain things, certain parameters while it's going on. While to start or to close the study, it's very complicated. So there's a lot more you have to do. And then there's another question. The question is, do we rotate in other departments? Usually the format of our fellowship program, the Novartis fellowship program, there's no rotations. You're straight up on the job and you're performing all the tasks. But recently there's been some flexibility where you can rotate. So I've actually rotated in other departments. I've rotated in the regulatory department, and I'm getting a lot of other experiences over there, which still enhances my experience as a clinical trial lead. Then the next question is, how about the job market after fellowship? Eddie, could you comment on that, please?
Sure. So of course, a fellowship is a great thing to have on your CV. It's a great experience. It definitely equips you with a very strong skill set for industry, especially if you are pursuing a position in the discipline in which you did your fellowship, or at least in the discipline in which you were exposed to in your fellowship. So I'd say that it definitely gives you a leg up on the competition. There are jobs out there. There certainly are. The economy is getting better. It's improving. speaking more locally, of course, Boston itself is a a biotech hub, so to speak, big for the biopharmaceutical industry. So I would say that this is a great place to be, that the job opportunities abound, but they're also, like fellowships, they are competitive. They are competitive positions, especially in the current economic climate. So I won't say that it's impossible. Of course, a fellowship definitely gives you that advantage, but it's not a given.
Thank you, Eddie. So the
Sure.
other question is, how many other fellows are there in the program? So the program has about, I think, 7 companies: Biogen, Genzyme, Novartis, Pfizer, BD, Takeda, that just added to it recently. And there's overall about 40 different fellowship positions. I think with I don't have an exact count with the increase of Takeda and the biomarker position, but it's around the vicinity of 40 fellowship positions. And then the last question is that we would take for the night is, would the biomarker development position provide exposure to many different types of trials, or would fellows be working on a few specific projects? So the biomarker development position, you'll be working on many different trials, because of course all the trials do have biomarkers that are being explored, both for efficacy and for those that are just exploratory to see if there's any interest or any interest could be developed into it. So the biomarker fellow will be involved in many different disease states, many different areas. I can't comment on oncology so far, but I don't know if they'll be involved in oncology, but they'll be involved in every other disease state. And I think that's the last question we have for tonight. Jim, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks to all the students for tuning in tonight. Great interest, terrific questions, and also, many thanks to Jude and to Eddie for giving up their evening just to share some of their experiences with you. Tonight's session was recorded. It'll probably be on our YouTube channel and on our website by tomorrow morning. If you want to review it again or share it with anybody that you think would be interested. You can find it on industrypharmacist.org in our resources section. So stay tuned for information about next Tuesday night's webinar, and we're also thinking about adding a 4th one in there, so stay tuned for information on that. Those of you who signed up and attended tonight will definitely be getting an email about future opportunities. So thanks again to everybody for your participation tonight, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jude.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Jim.